Hey there, Underground Sessions podcast listeners. As always, welcome back to our podcast. We are super excited about our conversation today. I'm joined by Claudia Tamas. She has a background in medicine, medical ethics. She's also a Colson Fellow, along with me. And we're going to be talking today about the topic of transgender. How do we think about that? How should Christians engage that topic? How do we minister to people? I think you'll really benefit from this conversation. So stick around and be blessed. All right, so we're here talking about a really important topic that's been in the cultural conversation, in the news recently, still in the news, even though it's sort of received quite a lot of backlash over the last 6 months or so. It's the topic of the transgender movement. How do we think about that from a Christian worldview perspective? And I am joined by Claudia Tamas. Claudia, she's in studio. And she is, a couple years ago, I did the Colson Fellows program, which we're launching here at Millington Baptist. Depending on when you're watching this, we have an info session on April 7th coming up, and then applications are going to be open May 1st. That's going to be super exciting. Claudia went through the program at another church, so we're fellow Colson Fellows, Colson Fellow siblings, I guess, here in the studio. And she did a lot of work on this topic as part of her Colson Fellow follow-up. So could you talk to the folks a little bit about your background, who you are, so they can get a sense on the work you've done on the topic?
Sure. First, thank you so much for having me here. I'm excited to be here and to share some of the things that I learned on this topic. So I completed the Colson Fellows 2022, I believe.
22? Okay.
Yeah, and I think we were the first in New Jersey to, I think they ran it at ZCC for the first time with Suzanne. Okay. And that expanded my view on several issues, some things that I was completely oblivious to, particularly cultural and social issues. And as far as my background, I was born and raised in Romania. I came here in 2004. I have teaching background, so I was a teacher back there, came to the States, and I pursued a healthcare type of education, received a clinical doctorate here in physical therapy, and then practiced in private practice for a little while. My specialty is women's health, so I love that field and wanted to expand my field, return back to school to nursing, received an RN, and then I'm following now with an advanced nursing degree, a nurse practitioner degree. So what brought me to this topic is pretty much what brought me to the healthcare field. It's just a deep preoccupation with human suffering and how I can alleviate it when it's possible. And so when I started looking into this topic, maybe I would say a year and a half ago, and the conversation started in ZCC. Pastor Mark there wanted to create a worldview group. He wanted to bring the cultural conversation in the church. Yeah. And so he wanted to bring hard topics like this and put them on the table and invite the church in so we can have a conversation and get some clarification how we would be looking at this from a Christian worldview. As you know, there is some interaction in culture from I say Christians, and a lot of the times is not fully representative of what Christianity is. And I think social media give us a lot of opportunities to, I guess, shoot ourselves in the foot sometimes. So we wanted to bring this conversation in the church, and we wanted to have questions and lay it on the table and get clarification on what's the best way to approach it from a Christian worldview. And so that was one of the drivers. And then I proceeded to learn more about this topic. And Yeah.
Yeah, well, I imagine that working in the healthcare field, this is something that you probably run into. So my son has special needs. I mentioned some medical complexities. We do a lot of work out of the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And I think it was a year or two ago, all the children's hospitals in the country were starting to get a lot of press over their gender-affirming care, units within the hospitals themselves. And even my own family practice that I go to, they have a whole wing for folks that are within the LGBT, Q plus IA community. Is that something you see in the healthcare field that you run into a lot? Is that part of what drove you to think about the topic?
So this is not part of my work. However, I do run into it in my studies.
Okay.
I would say two things. One, definitely when I started studying this, I did approach it on my knees. And with great compassion. As soon as you start looking around and start investigating this, you will start learning there's a lot of suffering. And a massive amount of casualties for those who are suffering from this affliction and the families that are involved. So that's how I approach it. And that's how I approach every patient that I interact with. That's how I learned to do it in my studies. And that's what robust medical ethics teach us. And if you remember maybe from your Colson course, that medical ethics, they are emergent from Christian ethics.
Yes.
Because going back to who started the first hospitals?
It was the Christians.
It was the Christians.
Yeah.
So every time we have this topic, especially now, I'm interacting with some conversations in my program and there's a lot of conversation on ethics. And I always bring it up back to where are these medical ethics coming from, specifically related to human dignity, the value of human life, how we treat people with respect to every single person has inherent dignity. And the fact that every person has autonomy. So we have to respect that. So where's that coming from? Well, free agency, right? And God's stamp on every single one of us. So these medical ethics, the true medical ethics that are not tainted with ideology, that's what they will they will teach, and that's what I would love to embrace, and I would like to see more of that.
Yeah.
And a lot of the times now it's not the case because of some influences from ideological the ideological movement, and I'm particularly sensitive to it because I did grow up in communism, and I have a sensor for ideology more than other people would. So I think when we're looking at this topic in the medical field, we definitely want to acknowledge that there are those providers that have strong medical ethics. And they are compassionate and want to help. But some of them may be confused, and others may be ideologically driven.
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly very interested in that topic of medical ethics. And I'll mention two things about the times. I remember very distinctly going back to I'm going to say it was like 2014, 2015. It was right after I got married, so it must have been 2014. The cover of Time magazine was had Laverne Cox on it, who was the prominent transgender, I guess male going to female. And I thought at that time, I looked at that and I said, that's going to be an issue. That's going to be a big issue for the Christian worldview, because it's not just dealing with who do you sleep with, who do you love. It's dealing with your core identity and how God made you. And it's very much become that over the last 10 years. The other thing that I would say is that Carl Trueman, and did you read the Carl Trueman book as part of the Colson Fellows program? He wrote a book called Stranger. What's the shorter book called? Stranger Than Strange, the Strange Times, or something like that. And he had a longer book where he was talking about kind of the tracing how we got to where we were in terms of the sexual revolution. But before he wrote that, my co-pastor actually ran into him down at Philadelphia Biblical University at the time. He was speaking at a conference, and he made the comment that he was working on a book, but this was before Strange New World, before Strange New World came out. And he said, I'm exploring the whole transgender idea, and my main motivation is it would have been incomprehensible for my grandfather to have the statement, I am a woman trapped in a man's body, or vice versa, would have been incomprehensible to my grandparents' generation. And now people just assume, with no questions, how did we get there? And that's kind of the topic for the book. But you know, your first question here: how did we get here? What would you say to that? How did we get to this place with the transgender movement in our current culture?
Yeah, so definitely, as you mentioned, books have been written on this. So for the time's sake, we can discuss a couple of these cultural trends or philosophies that led us here. And I think one that everyone will remember goes back to maybe 19th century, 1880 something, where Friedrich Nietzsche said, declared, right, God is dead, we have killed him. And then he was bright enough to recognize that when you have a world bereft of God, the order changes. So now we're entering an era of relativism, meaning that the absolute lawgiver is removed, so there's no absolute moral law. So consequently, then we had totalitarian regimes appearing, which I experienced that firsthand. And then we see some traces here in the West for sure, but I would say the domesticated version, right, is you can tell me what to do. It's my truth. Nothing. There's no moral law. So we're the lawgivers, so to speak, and we know how that goes. While in Europe, it was communism. Here we just have relativism. So there's no absolute to go by, and then the Bible tells us that the heart, right? If we're putting the moral law in ourselves, and we generate it in our heart, then that goes wrong. And I'll explain why, because we can look at outcomes. Even if you can have a conversation with someone who doesn't read the Bible, and how do you know this something doesn't work out? Well, you have to look at the outcomes. What over time, what kind of outcomes we have. But the Bible did warn us about this when it states that the heart is the most deceitful of all things and desperately wicked. So then if that's the center for morality, would we have a problem?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Now, in the sex and gender conversation, how would you define the difference between sex and gender? Some people want to talk about one or the other. What's the difference?
Yeah. So
is there a difference? We
have to go back a little bit, just around. I'm going to start with gender. Around 1950, going back to Professor John Money. He was a psychology professor.
I know the name. Yeah.
Actually, he started the gender clinic at Johns Hopkins University, and he's the first one who coined this term. gender. Up until then, gender was mainly used in languages like Latin languages, like Romanian would be, for example, the language I speak. And it was referred to nouns, feminine and masculine. And so that was the meaning of word gender. And John Money coins this term as a, defining it as a psychological expression of who you are sexually.
Yeah. Did he have any motivation in doing that? Like, why did all of a sudden he said, "I'm gonna invent this whole cloth"?
Gosh, yeah, there is a lot written about that.
There had to be some incentive for doing that, right?
Yeah. So even his own childhood, he had some problems there with his father was very abusive, and he had just a lot of trauma related to masculinity and embracing himself as a male, thinking of his father as just a brutal. He was very violent and abusive, and he equated masculinity with abusiveness, I suppose. So that was one of the drivers in his childhood. And then another one, I would say, he became very successful what he was doing for a short period of time. An author wrote a book on his most famous case, David Rimmer. It's a really long story, and you can find the story in the book is called "The Boy That Was Raised as a Girl." And Dr. Miriam Grossman, in her book, Lost in Translation, explains a little bit more about what happened in that case. But he basically took a child that was born as a male. Something happened during circumcision, and his genitals were, I suppose, destroyed. And so this was his first case where he advised the parents that, this whole idea of gender is a social construct. So if we raise this child as a girl, he will not know that he was a boy biologically. So they proceeded to, I suppose, maybe that was the first case where they proceeded to social affirmation and transitioning the child. It didn't end up well. David Rimmer ended up learning what was happening. He wasn't embracing this identity, and then he ended up ending his life in his 30s.
Yeah.
John Money was also a proponent for pedophilia, and he was supporting this as he was calling it a relationship between something. Two different ages or something like that. So he had a lot of tendencies in those directions.
Okay. So where did the word transgender come from? So that was sex and gender. Where did transgender come from?
Well, trans just refers to transitioning or crossing over.
Okay.
So this, I wouldn't use it as a stamp on anyone's identity, because even in medicine, if somebody has an affliction, we don't stamp their identity with it.
Yeah.
So we don't say somebody's a diabetic. We say this person has diabetes. We tend to not stamp people's identity with any affliction. And this is why I don't think that it goes along with strong medical ethics or Christian ethics, for that matter. If a person has an affliction, to stamp their identity with it.
Yeah. Good. So let's talk a little bit about the Christian perspective on this. How do you know, somebody might ask, how do you know that choosing a transgender identity is not in accordance with God's will? Because there's likely going to be some churches that argue for that. And they would often say, well, the Bible never really addresses the topic of transgenderism. How would you respond to something like that objection?
I have two ways to go about it myself. Maybe there are better answers, but one, of course, would be to go back to Genesis, where we are told that we are created male and female. We know that we're not here by accident. And when we start looking at the human body and understanding anatomy and physiology, and we come to the conclusion that this is designed, and even if you don't believe in a designer, you're still gonna conclude that this is such a complex operation. And there is a design to it. And you can deny the designer, but there is a design.
So you're rooted in sort of creation order ethics, creation order issues for the Christian.
Exactly,
Genesis
and the
1 and
fact
2,
that
yeah.
we are handmade. So that's where it's difficult to say that, oh yeah, that was an accident. And then a second for myself, and this is how we look at outcomes in healthcare too. The Bible tells us that we can appreciate a tree by its fruit. And this means that you can evaluate an action or a behavior or an intervention, for example, in medicine, by praising the outcomes. And so that's where, if we're starting to look at what the outcomes are when we medicalize, and let me just go back to, because it's important that we bring this up. It's actually the main reason why we're sitting here. It's called rapid onset gender dysphoria. If this hadn't occurred, we wouldn't be sitting here. And what is this?
Are you talking about the Abigail Schreier book, Irreversible Damage?
I'm talking about the social psychological phenomenon that was first called out by Dr. Lisa Lidman in 2015.
Okay.
So what did she see? So she's a medical professor at Brown University, and she's the first one that started to ask questions about what has happened here and why do we have a 5,000% increase in children that are experiencing this affliction. All of a sudden, they start going to these gender clinics in groups and after social media immersion. So she was the first one who went in the community and surveyed these families. So that study that she published in 2018 comes from those surveys, parental responses. And so what happened there is she made a distinction between, I would say, two groups, and I'm very cautious to call groups because we cannot put a blanket over this. Every single individual that suffers has to be addressed as an individual. So we don't want to put blanket over this concept. But when we're looking at this phenomenon that kind of emerged in the early 2000s, and then 2015 we saw this increase when Lisa Lidman calls it out. Prior to this, we had in the DSM-4, which is the Diagnostic Manual for Psychological Disorders, gender identity disorder defined as persistence, insistence that someone is or feels the other sex that starts at 2 to 4 years of age and continues. All of these children, they were surveyed in 2015, had no history. They were all teenagers, and there was no history of any gender dysphoria or this discomfort that was used to for the classification of this problem in the past. So they didn't fit this criteria. And this is why she called it out. It just seemed like it wasn't what we were seeing in the past, which was a very rare affliction, very serious condition. These children were constantly being tortured in their bodies. We have to have absolute great compassion to this, but it was very rare. And all of a sudden we're seeing this that doesn't fit the criteria, and it's this explosive increase. So it seemed that it really wasn't what it was called. And quite frankly, I wish it was us, the church, that went in the community and surveyed instead of a medical doctor that was secular. And I have a lot more to say about that. And maybe that's why we're sitting here. but she did this, and this is the group that I would say concerns me the most, and this is where we're moving a little bit too fast in terms of how we address it. And a lot of secular doctors with strong medical ethics are speaking against this. That's why the debate is ferocious in the medical community.
Because it's almost like there's a cultural narrative push to, if somebody wants this, just move them through the pipeline, no questions, no further investigation, and then all of a sudden their bodies can be totally irrevocably changed. Right.
Exactly.
Have you run into anybody who's gone through the detransition process, or did you do any work on that? That seems to be a lot more I'm seeing in the news.
Well, I will say that I didn't run personally. However, I read every book I could put my hands on, written by people that have gone through the process and then reconsidered what has happened to them, and they wrote about it. So you're probably familiar with Walt Hoyer, who so this is in that first category, right? So I read in all whatever I could find, but Walt Hoyer had this dysphoria for a long, long time, and when you read his book, if you do, be prepared. Is very hard. It's very deep. The pain is so severe that you can palpate it.
Maybe we can link it in the show notes if you.
Absolutely, and you see the resources are all there.
At the end. Okay, gotcha.
And see reading throughout this book, and there is a common theme that comes through all these books. So I read Laura Peltz, who's also a transitioner. I listened to Chloe Cole's everything she put out. I recently listened to Clementine Breen interviewed by Dr. Peterson, and it's this common theme that occurs. That has to do with the fact that, we just have to follow this protocol. So again, we're just grouping people, moving them along on a conveyor belt. And so then Lisa Littman goes back and does a study very recently, 100 transitioners, and she interviews. And 76% of them reported that they have not gone back to their providers to tell them. Because there's no place for them. Once you're out of the medical system and you don't wish to continue, there's right now no place in medicine for these people. And then another interesting thing that came from that study was that 55% of these people have reported that they really didn't receive adequate care, although they had multiple issues such as autism, depression, and other states, emotional states, or childhood trauma. None of that was addressed. And that's where we have a problem, where a lot of these children have these psychological problems, emotional problems, trauma, that has to be addressed, and they are sold a one-size-fits-all solution. You're not a girl, you're a boy, and that's why you're depressed, and that's why you're hurting. And that's extremely problematic because it's a very reductionist approach to a very complex issue. And that's always a red flag in every time in medicine when we address complex issue with a one simple solution, that's going to be problematic. And maybe you remember the frontal lobotomies, right, that were performed, not so long ago. There is a book called written by Dr. Marty Makary. It's called Blind Spots.
Yes,
when medicine
I like
gets
Marty.
It.
FDA chief now.
Yes, medicine gets it wrong and what it means to our health. So he talks a little bit about, frontal lobotomies, for which we used to have vans going through the cities for over a decade. And if you don't know what frontal lobotomy is, it's really you insert a long needle through the person's eye socket into their prefrontal cortex. And this was done in the name of compassion to heal depression and psychotic states. So you can imagine how devastating that was. So yes, medicine got it wrong before, and we don't have complete knowledge, even in our most brilliant states.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's turn kind of maybe towards the end here and talk a little bit about Christian engagement. So if you are somebody who knows somebody who's suffering from gender dysphoria, who thinks they're transgender, who's run into that either in your work, all of a sudden they're asking you to use your pronouns or whatever it is, how should Christians engage with that topic, and particularly people who suffer with gender dysphoria?
Yeah, and of course that's a great topic, and we have to have a very serious conversation in the church about how we go about engaging with, well, in general, with anyone who's suffering. And so compassion is first and foremost. And then we have to know, and we know this sometimes intuitively. We know from the Bible for sure, because that's how Christ addressed people. He responded to three very basic needs. He listened to the person, right? So the need to be heard, the need to be seen, right? And the need to be accepted. And by acceptance, we don't mean approval of behavior. And that's important when we engage with children as well. This is very important, right? That we have compassion for the affliction, just like any other affliction. If someone's suffering, we must show compassion there. And then something else comes back to me from J.K. Chesterton. I don't know if you're familiar with his writings. He's more of the, I suppose, the late 19th century, but he wrote a book called Orthodoxy. And something stood out when I read that book related to this topic. He said that today the world is filled with virtues that have gone mad, with Christian virtues that have gone mad, because they have become disconnected. So what does that mean? It means that if you're just showing compassion alone, right, that can lead into a very destructive place. For example, let's just take a simple example. If your child asks you for ice cream every morning for breakfast or for 3 meals a day, and you just want to show compassion, that's not going to lead into a good place. You have to also demonstrate truthfulness, right? No. Okay, here's what's true about this, what's going to happen, self-control, truthfulness. So all of these virtues have to be connected. So in every interaction, that has to be true.
Yeah.
If we do show compassion, that doesn't mean we compromise the truth. We still have to be truthful about the reality. So truthfulness, discipline, self-control, compassion, we have to connect them when we engage in any
good
relationship.
Yeah, I think I've heard somebody say, if you've met one transgender person, you've met one transgender person.
Exactly.
They all have different stories and how they got to that place, and it's worth getting to know them, so the touch points for the gospel.
And I'll say one more thing with that. There's so much to unpack here. The one area in which everyone will agree, and we have common ground for conversation in any field and any worldview, is that human beings are very complex.
Yes.
So everyone will agree with that. So you can have a really good start a conversation there. And there's one model that is used in medicine and psychology. It's called a biopsychosocial spiritual model.
Yeah.
And it's I suppose, a simplification of this approach. But that tells you that the person's more than just a body, more than just a mind, right? Not less than a body, but more than a body. So many times issues can occur in one of these domains, and it can be expressed in another. So, for example, right, when our physical body is sick, right, we can be depressed. So this is a problem in the biological domain, but it's expressed in the psychological domain. So why am I saying this? Because these children, they come and report dysphoria, they are not addressed in every of these domains. So that's how it has to be addressed. You have to recognize this is a complex person. I cannot treat them like I treated Joey before or Mary before. It has to be individually addressed, and it has to be addressed in its complexity. So at least you have to go through all of these domains. Well, let's see what's going on with their biology, right? Is there something going on? Is this child sick? And we see that the reports for gender dysphoria have increased, which has never seen before in girls. And why in girls, and why in girls before puberty and to puberty? Because puberty is way more traumatic for girls than for boys. So if you are given an option, right, it's definitely a period of serious discomfort. Sometimes if there's some deficiencies in her biology or chemistry, she'll then experience even more discomfort. And then what does she hear? Well, you can be a boy and not have to deal with this. So when the provider addresses somebody like that, you want to learn what is going on with her biology. Is there something going on there that's causing her to make that decision? What is going on in the social aspect of her life? Did her parents divorce? What are her relationships with her peers? Is something going on at school? Maybe this social aspect is spilling into her psychological. Did something happen traumatically in her past? And spirituality, is she connected, right? Or is she just she connected to God? Does she have a spiritual connection to the Lord or to the divine, or any connection there? We know that our hearts are restless until we find rest in Him. So that's the complex approach, right? To simplify it. And then when you see this children going in and just given one medical approach, like let's give the now puberty blockers, for example, which is a whole other topic about the devastation that they cause. And then how we look at risks to benefits, even just when we're looking at medical ethics alone, that looking at, let's say, two aspects, because I'm involved in my work with older adults, especially women that suffer from osteoporosis. And we know that puberty blockers in girls will cause osteoporosis. These are the formative years for the bone. And we are inducing menopause in a 12-year-old girl.
Wow.
So talking about the fruit of this tree, so how do you recognize then the tree? Well, you look at this fruit and then you see the devastation, right? The long life medicalization. Like I mentioned before, we already know, and there's a black box warning on puberty blockers, that they stunt growth, they disrupt bone metabolism, they cause brain swelling. So these are just a few of the so many destructive consequences of these medication, not to mention the lack of studies. And the studies that these protocols are based on are very low-level studies. And this is not my opinion. This was mentioned in a very comprehensive review in Great Britain, the Cass Review, 2024, is published by Dr. Hilary Cass, the chair of the National Health Service there. And she looks at all this review, and other doctors sounded the alarm here, that the level of these studies is very low, unacceptably low, to give these protocols in children as a standard.
Yeah, good. Well, maybe as we finish up, what are some resources that you would recommend for, families or people that are engaging this topic, suffering from the topic? Books, articles, organizations, what would you recommend?
Yeah, 100%. I have so much that I can recommend. And if anyone who's listening wants to get their hands on my resources, I have so many, and I'm more than happy to share the document. But I will say that if you look at a few categories, is somebody like that just wants to learn on the topic. I would recommend a Christian worldview book that we studied in those 10 weeks of our worldview group by Andrew Walker, God in the Transgender Debate.
Yeah, it's a great book.
And then if you want to learn a little bit more from a medical perspective, Miriam Grossman's book, Lost in Transnation. She's a medical doctor. It's
Lost in Transnation.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
So those are a few, and then there are many others. If you are somebody who has a child that is struggling or is looking for legal support, or organizations that can help, there are so many. Just to mention, Family Research Council, Advocates Supporting Children. Dr. Miriam Grossman has Do No Harm Medicine website filled with resources. So those are just a few of many.
Good. Well, Claudia, thanks so much for coming on, for talking with us about your expertise and the research that you've done. I hope this was really helpful to those of you that were out there watching, and that you will benefit from it. Check out the resources we have listed in the show notes, and we might need to have you come back and talk about your experience with communism, as you were mentioning your story. That's a whole other topic, right? We can chat about at some point. So so thanks so much for being here, and we'll hope to see you next time on the Underground Sessions podcast.
It was great to be here. Thank you.